Hello, folks. This is Dan Shapley from Riverkeeper. It is just now 1 o'clock, and we have about 10 out of 25 people attending who have registered. So we're just going to wait a couple minutes and see if a few more log on in the next couple minutes, and then we will be getting started. Okay, again, this is Dan Shapley from Riverkeeper. We're just waiting for a few more registrants to log on, so I appreciate your patience. We'll be getting started in just a minute. All right, I think we're going to get started. My name is Dan Shapley. I'm with Riverkeeper. That's Hudson Riverkeeper for some of you who are dialing in from around the country today in New York. And just before we get started, I want to orient you to the webinar. Those of you who are on and watching, you will be on mute the whole time I'm presenting. The presentation is going to last about 30 minutes, maybe couple minutes more, but just around there. And there is a handout you'll see on the right side of your screen. You should see a little dashboard, and if you click the little arrow next to handout, you'll see the you can download the report that we'll be talking about today. We'll also follow up with an email with a link to it, so you don't have to worry about finding it now, but you can access it at any time. And there's also right below that a chat window, and that's where you'll go to ask questions. Feel free to write them in as we go through the presentation, but I'm going to wait until the end to answer them. We will be recording the webinar, and I think that is probably the next step. So I will pause just a minute, and we will start recording, and then I'll get into the presentation. right, welcome to our webinar today. My name is Dan Shapley from Riverkeeper. This webinar is called Protecting Drinking Water at its Source, Recommendations for the Hudson River. And we are here really to brief the findings and recommendations of a report that the Center for Watershed Protection conducted with a report that was commissioned by Riverkeeper on behalf of 7 communities that rely on the Hudson River for drinking water. We'll go over, why and how the project got started to work with these communities, and again, the findings and recommendations, and then we will touch on some of the immediate next steps. Key points for the presentation: source water protection is a proactive and effective strategy to protect drinking water and high quality drinking water. The Hudson River is a major source of drinking water in our region, something that a lot of people actually don't realize. And that communities, with the help of state agencies, federal agencies, and nonprofit partners, can and should have an active role in source water protection. The Riverkeeper has a product I'll describe a little bit called I shouldn't say product, it's free. Everyone can use it. It's called the Drinking Source Water Protection Scorecard. And that's what I'll describe the results of having used it for this water supply. And it really helps to provide a roadmap to get communities started on source water protection. First, for those of you who might be unfamiliar with Riverkeeper, the organization, we started with this pipe. This is an oil discharge pipe in the mouth of the Croton River 50-some years ago. And a group of fishermen and others got together in a room and not far from where this pipe was doing its work, and said, we're sick of this, we're sick of what's happening in the Hudson River. They got together and decided to do something about it. Found a law that had been on the books for a generation without any real use, and they dusted it off, put it to use, and stopped this particular pipe from discharging, and then took the success of that and went after the next pipe and the next polluter and the next one after that, and in that way had a real role in cleaning up the Hudson River, even in those very early days before even the modern Clean Water Act was passed. Enforcing environmental laws remains part of the bedrock of what Riverkeeper does. Another part of it is having a patrol boat on the Hudson. So you can see here the Riverkeeper patrol boat, which is piloted by Captain John Lipscomb, and he takes the boat from New York Harbor all the way up to Troy, New York, 150 plus miles, which is the length of our Hudson River estuary. So that's tidal all the way from New York Harbor up to Troy. He patrols out the Mohawk River and the upper Hudson as well, hundreds and even thousands of miles that he patrols each year, being the eyes and the ears and the voice for the water. And the third part of our organization that we really stand on currently is community science. So we partly with John's help on the boat, and partly with an army of volunteers out throughout the watershed, we gather more than 400 samples at more than 400 locations throughout the Hudson River estuary and the tributaries that feed it. And that data gives us a platform for advocacy on a range of water quality issues, including the quality of drinking water. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but we're going to be talking about watersheds today. It's important to understand, of course, that a watershed is the land area that drains to a particular body of water. And source water protection is really just watershed protection that is applied to a drinking water intake, a public drinking water supply. And that can be a river, a lake, it can be a groundwater. And the protection, again, is just a watershed-based strategy to protect the quality of that water so that the treatment costs are lower and the risk of contamination from any kind of contaminant is less. In New York State, of course, we've set the gold standard for how to do source water protection, and that is because of the protection that has been done for New York City's drinking water supply, which you can see on this map. New York City is down in the lower part of the screen, and then it's the watershed that supplies its drinking water is quite far from the city, upstream and connected via aqueduct to the people drinking the water. And the city, as as I'm sure many of you know, is involved in a long-term, multifaceted, multi-barrier approach to protecting the high quality of its reservoirs. And just to provide an example, I have some numbers here. The city has recently committed to spending about $720 million on that multi-barrier approach over the next 10 years. Sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but it's actually not so much if you consider the 9 million people or so that drink the water, and the investment per person drinking the water is not too high at all. And it's a vast sum less than would be required to filter the water supply. That would probably be about $11 billion over the same 10 years. So again, source water protection is a proactive and cost-effective strategy. The question that Riverkeeper has been asking, particularly in the last couple of years, is if New York City water serves half of our state, which it does, then what about the other half? How are our other public drinking water supplies protected? And unfortunately, we also have the example in our area of what happens when we fail at this. And this aerial image is showing Newburgh's, it's the city of Newburgh's drinking water supply. That reservoir is called Washington Lake. It actually lies in the two towns neighboring the city, and its watershed is also in those two neighboring towns. Those of you who are dialing in from out of state, New York is a home rule state. So all land use decisions are made by the local municipality. So in this case, and that's a fundamental challenge that we have in New York for source water protection and watershed protection in general, is those generally downstream drinking the water don't have control over a lot of the decisions made upstream that have a high impact on that water. In the case of Newburgh, what happened was there was a firefighting foam used at this Air National Guard base. That firefighting foam, I'm sure, as everyone has seen in the news, it contains a chemical called PFOS, which is toxic. That chemical got out it was actually spilled, contaminated the groundwater, infiltrated the stormwater pipes, leaving the base, and into the streams that feed into the reservoir. That in turn produced a crisis for the health crisis for the population of almost 30,000 people, who are left to wonder what that exposure over many years has meant for their health. And it's led to an investment so far by our state of at least $50 million and probably more. So again, we see the flip side of failure to protect drinking water at its source being costly both in public health and in dollars. So Riverkeeper developed our drinking water protection scorecard out of the Newburgh crisis. We looked at not only this novel, relatively, well, I shouldn't say novel, but unregulated contaminant PFOS, but really the overdevelopment of the watershed in general and the many risks that were posed to this water supply. And we asked, how could this have happened? And so we developed this scorecard tool to help other communities learn from Newburgh's crisis, also to help Newburgh itself, of course. And the scorecard is essentially an audit of protection programs that are available in our state, available through best management practices or through rules and regulations that can be used to protect public water. We also think of it as a sort of gateway drug. It's not going to tell communities everything they need to know, but it does identify key gaps and opportunities and set communities up for the next steps of work of developing source water protection programs. So the next thing that we did at Riverkeeper was start to look around at some of our big surface water supplies. Our specialty being in rivers, we think about the surface water and know more about it, and so that's where we wanted to put our emphasis. This is just a look at some of the big surface water supplies in our region, and you can see the Hudson River estuary itself. So our core mission area is one of the largest drinking water supplies in our area. And for those of you who are local, you'll see that these are the communities that rely on the Hudson River as their drinking water source. It's the city and town of Poughkeepsie, the town of Hyde Park, village and town of Rhinebeck, and the towns of Lloyd and Esopus. And within each of the towns, not the whole town is served by public water, but there are water districts in each of those that are served by public water that comes from the Hudson River. Now, in addition to Newburgh's crisis, which sort of galvanized these communities and the Hudson River to work together with Riverkeeper, the other thing that was really high on their mind was a real concern about the increase in crude oil transportation, which was happening on our river and has been since about 2012. And it ebbs and flows in volumes. We're not at a high point right now, but we've had at times several barges a day full of crude oil going downriver, long trains full of oil hugging the banks and going right by our drinking water supply, or that portion of the river. And that was very near and present concern and risk to these communities they felt somewhat powerless about. And just to underscore that this is a real risk, the risk of a spill, this is how the Coast Guard itself now defines what it calls the worst case spill scenario for this region. It, for a long time, considered the worst case spill a spill in New York Harbor, where commerce would be affected and could be impacted by a spill. But now we've, through work with the Coast Guard, helped them to understand that the risks to the ecology of the river and to the public health via the drinking water supply particularly is a serious risk. So you can see the worst case spill they consider is a 7+ million gallon spill of crude oil. And for those of you not familiar with the local geography, this spill that they consider is essentially right at the upstream point of the drinking water intakes for the communities, which you can see here. So these are the locations of 5 drinking water plants that serve those 7 communities. Because some of the communities share water from the same plant, we have 5 plants but 7 communities. And so you can see this is where they are, and this is our best understanding at this point of where the source watershed is. Now, the Hudson River watershed as a whole is vast, I think 14,000 square miles. So but the area that the Department of Health has so far identified as the source water area for these water supplies is a somewhat smaller area, but still quite a large land area in our region. So Riverkeeper took the next steps of working with our communities here in the mid-Hudson region. We had these goals. One, to just organize them, and we are, as I'll get to, we're seeing an intermunicipal council that is formally going to finish the work of coming together later this month. We wanted to give them a unified voice on issues affecting drinking water, and particularly crude oil. That's already happened in that they were able to participate in the Coast Guard safety assessment process that happened through the winter. And then we wanted to use the scorecard that we had developed to help the communities orient themselves and get started with source water protection. We've also started a study of water infrastructure needs, because in New York we've been successful, Riverkeeper and a number of other organizations and advocates, to establish under Governor Cuomo a $2.5 billion Clean Water Infrastructure Act. So there's more money available, and some of that money is available specifically for communities that want to work together and invest in their infrastructure as a group. So we are studying those infrastructure needs because another motivating force for the communities to work on this project was the prospect of being more competitive for some of that state assistance and potentially federal assistance, which gets to the last point, that we're building the case for funding and support. So we contracted the Center for Watershed Protection, which is a national organization which has expertise that we don't, and has a deep history of all aspects of watershed planning, and they have environmental engineers on staff, and they have worked on source water protection programs for their river-based sources of drinking water. So we were able to contract out with them because we had a grant from the Park Foundation, and we also had support from Riverkeeper members. I don't know if I mentioned, we are a nonprofit organization, and we were able to pull together this report, which we published in February. The scorecard looks at a number of factors. Again, it's sort of a gateway drug, and it asks communities to sort of gather together available documents, take a look at them, and give them a critical read. So we look at source water assessment. If there is a source water protection program, ask a number of questions about it. if there's other types of watershed planning that maybe other than source water protection, what are its goals? Is there funding for it? Are there prioritized projects? Take some look at land use, stream and wetland protections, and open space prioritization. So again, it's a series of questions and reference to available public documents that communities can use to sort of get a handle on where they are right now, and that helps to point them towards their next steps. The basic question again is, for any community picking up this tool or starting a source water protection project with another tool, are we more like New York City in that we have a well-protected multi-barrier approach to watershed protection, or are we more like Newburgh, not necessarily in that we have contaminated water today, but are we vulnerable to contamination because we don't have robust programs in place? So looking at some of the findings, we found that the source water assessments, which were required under the Safe Drinking Water Act to map the source water areas for all public drinking water supplies and identify potential risks and threats within them, with the intention that that assessment would then be used to create a protection plan. And for these water supplies, the source water assessments are out of date, about 12 years old, and they rely in some cases on some very old data for land use, particularly 25-year-old land use. And we live in a region that has seen a fair amount of development in that time and changes in land use. And it doesn't consider some newer risks, including some of the emerging contaminants that have been of interest, and certainly not crude oil, which wasn't transported on the river at that time. We found, and again, the Center for Watershed Protection findings found that we just don't have a source water protection program, which is not a shock. That if we had one, we probably wouldn't have started this project. So that and additionally, that some very good watershed planning that's been done in the region on some of our tributaries to the Hudson hasn't always focused really narrowly on water quality outcomes. It's focused certainly generally on water quality improvements, and it hasn't had a really focus on protecting the source water for these communities. We found that water quality issues that have come up for these communities have been addressed through upgrading treatment and not through addressing reduction in source or improvements in the source water quality. And particularly, the examples of that are the Poughkeepsie has built over $18 million of treatment upgrade to deal with disinfection byproducts. Another of the towns is scoped out a project for, I think, about $7 million for similar upgrades to again, deal with disinfection byproducts. So whether or not there's a realistic way to address the presence of the formation of disinfection byproducts through a source water strategy, the communities weren't coordinated and they weren't talking to one another to even understand that they had this common problem, and to ask what other alternatives there might be to address it. They only had basically directive from the Department of Health based on their testing data to work on upgrades. So by now working together into the future, we hope that the next sort of challenge that comes up will be a much more multifaceted decision-making process that could address water quality as well as treatment. Another important finding is that regulation of important watershed characteristics like wetlands, streams, and prioritization of open space and even stormwater runoff is unevenly regulated in the source water area. So we have some urban areas with stormwater regulations. We have other more rural communities or smaller villages that aren't subject to the same stormwater requirements, for instance. And we have streams of various classifications that are protected to more or less degree. So there's inconsistency across the area. And then finally, there was at the time of the report, no intermunicipal organization that was organized to focus on source water protection, and no dedicated funding for it. So now to move on from the major findings to the top recommendations of the report. First, to share the results, which we're doing today, and we had another webinar earlier that focused on reaching some of our state federal and county agencies that will hopefully be involved in some of the next steps. So we've accomplished that. Check mark. Other main priorities or recommendations are to, of course, update those source water assessments, which are out of state. And what we are encouraging is rather than doing those point by point for each of the drinking water intakes, to start to look at this as a single water supply shared by 5 communities. So the vast majority of the watershed area is shared by all of these drinking water intakes. So these should be done as a single unit. And then, of course, you know, the original source water assessments in New York State were done largely by the Department of Health, state and county departments of health. So this time we're encouraging a multi-stakeholder approach that would include agencies and municipalities at all levels. And of course, to include additional risks that have come up since those first assessments were done, and chiefly among them risks, again, of crude oil transport, build out of potential with the current zoning, and also the risks of climate change, because we are on tidal estuary, so we have sea level rise as well as flooding potential risks. Third major recommendation was to form an intermunicipal coalition and to start to hold regular meetings with multiple agencies and groups to develop that source water protection plan, and finally to seek funding. When we talk about source water protection planning, the Center for Watershed Protection pointed to one, you know, sort of a very good process, which is outlined by the AWWA, the organization that represents public utility, drinking water utilities. So it's for those familiar with watershed planning, it's a familiar process, but it starts with, you know, that stakeholder involvement that was identified as some of the top recommendations, creating a vision, understanding the watershed as it is today, and then setting goals, developing a plan, and starting to implement it. And then, of course, making it all a circular process so that you can come back and make sure that that plan is continually relevant. So this is the type of planning that we are now encouraging and that the communities are embracing as a next step. There are other alternatives to this process, and we have the good fortune in the Hudson River Estuary that we have the Hudson River Estuary program, a part of the DEC, which has a source water specialist who is developing a framework for doing a similar analysis that would get through at least the characterization and some goal setting with the community. So that might be a tack they take in addition. Let's touch on some other recommendations, particularly some of the, and again, the report's available and encourage you to look through the whole thing, but I pulled out some of the other key recommendations I think might be particularly of interest to some of the audience today. Expanding stormwater protections into non-regulated areas that currently aren't regulated, and coordinating the implementation. So we have Stormwater Coalition on one side of the river in Dutchess County, but not in Ulster, and the communication between the two and within the source water area could probably be coordinated in a more robust way to really get at some of those water quality benefit goals that are embedded in the stormwater regulations. To conduct code reviews in each of the 7 municipalities to see how evenly water courses and steep slopes and key features like that are protected in local zoning. To look at source water protection in comprehensive plan reviews. Another recommendation is to look at starting watershed planning for tributaries that come into the area of this drinking water supply, and to focus those plans on water quality protection or improvement as needed. Also to start working with the DEC to on some of those inconsistencies that were identified in stream and wetland classifications and protections. And then finally, convening land trusts so that there can begin a process to prioritize parcels that might benefit this water supply by being protected. So our next steps are to the 7 communities, we're happy to say, have each passed a local resolution authorizing the formation of an intermunicipal council, and they will each be signing that agreement on May 31st. And those of you who are local, please join us, 1 p.m. Poughkeepsie at the Maris Boathouse, where we'll have a signing ceremony and talk about the project again. Riverkeeper is completing a water and wastewater infrastructure report that I mentioned, and we will again hope that will help the communities get coordinated and be more competitive for some of the state and federal financing and grants that are available for water and wastewater infrastructure upgrades. Third, we're working on really kind of aligning all of the recommendations with potential funding sources so that the group and nonprofits and others that want to coordinate and assist with implementing some of these recommendations can see a pathway toward getting the help from available grants to accomplish some of those next steps. So we'll be working on that in the very short term. And then separately from the Hudson River project I've described, Riverkeeper is working on a revision and publication of the scorecard online. So it'll be, it's already freely available and you can download and put it to use today if you'd like. But what we're aiming to do is to just, one, draw on the experience of having seen it used once and been through the process to make some tweaks and just some, relatively minor improvements. And then also just to make it easier to use for people coming to it fresh. So that will be available. It already is available on our website, and you can see the address there. These are the some of the members that we've been working with in the Intermunicipal Council, made up of elected officials as well as the water operators of the municipal drinking water plants. They are calling themselves, when they sign that agreement, the Hudson River Drinking Water Intermunicipal Council, or I love this, they are now starting to call themselves the Hudson 7. So they've hit upon branding already. So with that, I will turn to questions. I think we're doing pretty well on time. Again, if you have questions, please put them into the chat box and then I will field them and answer them. The lines will remain muted. So you can talk all you want, but we will not hear you. Okay, so one question is, what will the 7 communities do differently to ensure that existing stormwater erosion and sediment control regulations are enforced in order to protect water quality? In many cases, the current system of monitoring enforcement is not working. Speaking from the perspective of Riverkeeper in this is that, we agree that in general, the stormwater regulations in our state do not do enough and don't do a great job and there's inadequate enforcement and implementation of our stormwater rules. So what we hope on one level is that through this project, these elected officials have become already, I think, vastly more educated, many of them, on sort of the impact of these kinds of decisions and these kinds of this kind of enforcement. So I think there's a really fundamentally important education component that will lead to action. And then I think through some of the suggestions to better implement and coordinate stormwater controls on a regional basis, we can influence better enforcement in that way as well. And then in areas that aren't currently regulated, should they take that recommendation to sort of adopt stormwater rules that are consistent or maybe even better than what the state requires and the federal government requires, then we'll see hopefully some of these stormwater regulations even expanded into areas that aren't currently served. So it's certainly not a direct line from point A to B, but I think that this process will help to encourage much better stormwater compliance and better water quality through that compliance. Okay, just checking for some more questions here. You'll see in the chat box, those of you who are enjoying the webinar live, there's a link to the scorecard as well as the scorecard report for the Hudson 7. And Do you have approximate number of Hudson River cities, towns for whom the Hudson River is a backup water supply? We are, so there is one community that actually receives water from the Hudson River that's not in the Hudson 7, and that's the town of East Fishkill. It's connected to the Poughkeepsie plant via a water pipeline the county owns. And that pipeline serves one small neighborhood and primarily a commercial and industrial complex, a real center of economic activity. So over time, I hope that we can also engage them in this effort. I have every reason to suspect that we will be able to. We haven't focused on them to date. So it's not exactly a backup, but it is another set of users of this drinking water supply. I am not aware of any communities outside of those that is expecting the Hudson River would be a backup supply, but it is the, you know, there are reports and there are studies that have been done over time, and you will see references in different documents talking about the richness of water in this region. And one of the big reasons, you know, things that they point back to is the vast, you know, quantity of water in the Hudson River. So I think that while they're maybe not specific backups identified for specific communities, there's a broad, you know, sort of understanding and thought that the Hudson is there if we need it. Even New York City has for a long time had a backup intake ready to access in the Hudson River. My understanding is that is not, there's no intention to really use it, but the fact is it's there. If something were to happen with the reservoirs and the river were a better source, the infrastructure is largely in place to make use of it. Okay, next question. How would legacy contaminants be integrated into source water assessment and the protection program? So in the Hudson, we have a rich history of industrial use, you could say, and legacy contamination. There's also more, you know, less legacy, but more, you know, real-time contaminants from like the perfluorinated compounds like PFOS and firefighting foam, PFOA and Teflon and non-stick cookware, non-stain resistant clothing. These contaminants, we have not identified specific strategies around specific contaminants at this stage of planning. That would be something that I think would be an important step that would come out of the source water protection planning as it gets more, you know, really gets started. We have in our river both the legacy contaminants such as PCBs and also a lot of wastewater discharged upstream of these drinking water supplies. So looking at source areas that might be either, you know, areas of brownfields and the like, wastewater treatment plants or farming in our region as potential sources, and understanding those and their potential to affect these drinking water supplies would be part of, you know, a robust source water planning that would follow. Okay, any advice for a river group in New England that hasn't organized itself yet? What is the most important ingredient, money, time, or other? Well, to date, for us, I would say the most important ingredient was time. You know, Riverkeeper really committed to just spending the time to get to know these communities and bring them together. The way, the nuts and bolts of it really started with, in real way, with a conversation that I had with the mayor of Rhinebeck, who was he was concerned about aspects of oil transportation on the river, and he and I were talking about a really kind of narrow issue related to that, and then really just started to open up the conversation about, hey, you know, we're not the only ones that rely on this drinking water source. What can we do? And so we felt that having he and I felt that having him be the kind of ambassador to the other communities was a really effective way to start the collaboration. So it was that invitation from the one mayor to the executives of each of the other municipalities to first just meet and
we met over beer at the Millhouse Brewery in Poughkeepsie, which had just brewed a beer for Riverkeeper, and to highlight the fact that the beer source water, the brewery's source water, is the same as the public drinking water supply. So it's the Hudson River. So they were great and sort of did this promotional beer making for us, and that helped to build, just some basic partnership. We hosted a meeting and got the ball rolling there. So then it really just became the time to do the outreach, to have well-organized communications, well thought out communications to the group, to bring them along at the speed they were ready to go, which in this case was pretty fast. We've just been at this 10 months, which is pretty fast in government time to get to an intermunicipal agreement, I think. So time investment, two other important ingredients, I think, in terms of the motivation for these communities to work together was the sense of crisis, to be honest. That Newburgh is in their backyard, and that has been a point of, it's been in the press. It's the issue of source water protection in our state, and the renewed focus on it has come out of the experience in Newburgh largely, and frankly, Riverkeeper's advocacy to highlight the need for it. So there, on the one hand, the sense of crisis, and then also the sense of opportunity that there was, that there is new money available specifically for source water protection from the state, because again, through the same advocacy pathway, and then also that there's an opportunity to get more needed money for things they already knew they needed in terms of water and wastewater infrastructure if they were working together. So time investment to focus their attention, and then we did spend the money to hire the Center for Watershed Protection, but in the scale of what is spent on things, it wasn't a great amount. It was like $6,000 or so. So that for that kind of money to have a real expert come in to use the scorecard and develop recommendations, I think is a relatively small investment. I wouldn't point to that as the biggest barrier, as much as time and making the case and getting them working together. The other thing I would say is that, as exciting as this project is for this drinking water supply and being a part of the Hudson River, and it's high profile, and there's all kinds of great things that come around it, it's frankly on the easier scale of source water protection cooperative, I think, because it doesn't involve that upstream downstream dynamic that is present in so many drinking water supplies, where the reservoir is upstream in one community and the people drinking the water are downstream. And so getting the cooperation in those cases is harder, because they don't always see the shared resource in the same way, and the interests of the upstream community may not be well aligned. So in this case, the interests were very well aligned for these communities. So I think it's low-hanging fruit in the source water realm, in that they, I think, are ready to do this in a way that some other supplies might be more challenged to. Yes. So another question or statement about legacy contaminants is manufactured gas plant coal tar, and this is a really, really good point, because we have in Poughkeepsie the drinking water plant, and Highland across the river, very close to it, really quite close to a 9-acre coal tar discharge point, or there's 9 acres of contamination on the river bottom, and there is a cleanup plan that has been formulated and is going to be implemented there soon. And one of the things that we found through this process was that if the communication had happened from the agencies, coordinating that cleanup to these communities, it really wasn't focused on the potential for drinking water impacts, and they certainly weren't active and aware of the process to develop this cleanup program. And we've recently highlighted for the DEC potential that they've at least have to make sure that they are considering the potential impacts to drinking water supply, because for a coal tar site, the typical sort of thing that the Department of Health does is to determine if their groundwater source is at risk. But in this case, you have the coal tar essentially in the surface water drinking water supply. And we know that coal tar bubbles right up. You can see it from the walkway over the Hudson, sometimes bubbling up out of the river from that particular site. So it's a great point. And there's a resource that's just been added to the chat box you can see for more information about manufactured gas plants in New York. Okay, so the question is the original source water area delineation sufficient, or should it include more of the watershed? This is a great question, and it's been an open question for me from the beginning. Right now, so one of the findings I didn't put up on the screen, but the Center for Watershed Protection did at least vet the Department of Health's delineation, which was defined for an estuary as 15 miles upstream, 5 miles downstream from any of the intakes, and then the kind of, for those of you who know something about watershed delineation, the Huck 12, so the first kind of big catchment area of each of the tributaries in that region. So what the finding that the Center for Watershed Protection had is that that delineation is at least a standard practice and a reasonable place to start for this type of water supply. But I believe, and the a long-term recommendation identified in the report is to really do more modeling to understand where that is an adequate description and where it might not be, because different types of contaminants can flow different distances and change character over that time. I think that it might even differ based on what type of concern you're trying to address. So there might be different scales for different types of analyses. But at this point, we don't have anything better, and there's reason to at least point to it and say it's based on good standard practice. And so that's what we're starting with. Okay. Woodstock's drinking water supply is from wells in the hamlet of Bearsville, where the aquifer is located, and the town is also a half a mile in the New York City watershed, and it's the watershed for the city of Kingston, and partially also the town of Ulster's drinking water supply. And the Hudson 7 communities are downstream of the confluence of the lower Sopus. So in other words, to summarize that for people out of the region, the town of Woodstock, basically every inch of the town, give or take an inch, is part of somebody's drinking water supply. Any suggestions for groundwater protection resources for Woodstock Land Conservancy or town of Woodstock, because the town's wells are outside of New York City watershed? So one of the challenges, the first thing is, I think the scorecard is probably a little bit more useful for surface water supplies, but you can pick and choose, and you could use it and get and have it help you jumpstart for wells as well. So I'd say that's one thing you could start with, and I'd be happy to help you. For groundwater, one of the rules of thumb that we've seen as we've researched this issue is that those source water assessments that the health department did 12 or so years ago, because they were working with a relatively small amount of money and had to do these for the entire state, they didn't get very site specific on really delineating what land area is important for wells. Because that requires a pretty site-specific hydrogeological assessment. And so they basically just drew a circle around each wellhead and said, that's going to be the area we look at for a source water assessment. A reasonable approach given the resources they had, but not particularly useful for a Woodstock or another community relying on their wells, because it's not really telling you what land area is really critical for recharge and for prevention of seepage of some contaminant that might affect the water quality. So the first, so a couple resources that you might look at. Again, you could try the scorecard as a first start to just jump into the issue and assemble some of the key documents, start to get a critical understanding of where you're at. The New York Rural Water is a nonprofit organization with federal funding, I believe, to do source water assessments in rural communities in New York State, and they do a great job. The only problem is there's just one guy who does it. He's great, but you know, he's one person, so you can get on his list. It's not, I don't think it's even any cost to the community doing that. There are also some, you know, longer term, like in the next 2 years or so, I think the U.S. Geological Survey will be improving, as I understand it, some mapping and modeling techniques that will make it a little easier for a locality to get a better sense of where that source watershed area is. But I think for many water supplies, and this is a great example of it, it's just figuring out what is the land area we're talking about that's really, really important. And then rethinking an assessment of potential risks in that area, whether they be from the zoning maybe being not set up to protect well enough, or the presence of a contaminant source. So that's what I would recommend as some first steps. And again, I'd be happy to talk more with you if that's not enough to get started. Okay, another question. This is great. I'm so glad they're questions. Okay, because most perfluorinated compounds, PFASs, PFAS chemicals, the PFOAs, the PFOSs of the world, because most of those chemicals have been phased out of use over time, they should be considered as a legacy contaminant. Their persistence in the environment is a huge challenge. In addition, the challenge to find out where they can be found should be addressed in the assessment process. Yeah, that's true. There's 3,000, I think, perfluorinated compounds out there, and so we haven't phased out all of them by any stretch. There's been a you know, stop of manufacture of PFOA. There's the same with PFOS. Those chemicals have largely been replaced with other what are, you know, short chain PFAS chemicals. There's a lot of science going on that is, you know, and it points in different directions to some extent. I mean, in a nutshell, what I think there's not a lot of this is a broad brush and too general, but I'm going to say it anyway. You know, other perfluorinated compounds that are replacing the ones that we know to be bad, still are toxic, but I think they're less toxic because they're less persistent and they don't stick around in our bodies as long. But there's still a lot of these. There's a calculation that I saw scientists do recently where they were able to measure PFOA and other of related compounds in standard, you know, municipal wastewater discharges, and pretty systematically correlate it to the size of the volume of the discharge. So there's still a lot of these chemicals that are coming through us, through our clothing, through our food containers and other sources, out through our waste streams and into surface water through our wastewater treatment plants. So by no means are these chemicals gone. We've phased out some of them to some degree, but those that we phased out as are still in the environment, unfortunately, forever. They basically just don't go away. So we're going to be dealing with some level of these for a long time. What we see in a case like Newburgh, just to be clear, is even though there's a pervasive low level of these chemicals everywhere in us, in the environment, you can measure them in rainwater, there's still significant localized sources, such as that area in Newburgh, which is the result of spills of concentrated firefighting foam that contaminated groundwater, and that results in a higher exposure that's unacceptable to a city population. So even where we are unfortunately have to accept that we're going to be exposed to some low levels of a lot of chemicals because of the world we live in, there still can be acute concerns from particular sources, and Newburgh is an example of that. Okay, I think that's all the questions. So thank you all. Very efficient half-hour presentation, 23 minutes of questions. We're done within an hour. Great job, everyone. Thank you for being a part of this. My contact information is on the screen. We will follow up with an email that just has a link to the report and some of the other links that we've offered here, so you have a record of them. And other than that, thank you very much, and good luck with your own source water protection efforts.